welcome to the June 11th edition of Ask a Historian with Heritage Mississauga. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga, and each week we invite you to send in your questions, the things that you're curious about or interested in, and send them to us. And together, as we make through these times of COVID-19, with the hashtag, I guess, Together Apart, we will explore and wander down memory lane and look at the story of this place, the fascinating story of the city of Mississauga, and we can explore some local history together. So please send us your questions, your curiosities, things you're interested in, things you'd like to learn more about, things you want to share, and let's wander down memory lane together. And so thank you, and we look forward to receiving your questions.
Hey, what's happening? It's George Stroumboulopoulos here. I'm a Moulton boy, through and through. Grew up on Sills Road, hopped the fence in my backyard. I'm on Airport Road. Used to work at Mr. Submarine on Airport. I worked on Goreway. I worked at the Woodbine Center around the corner. My media production company is called Moulton 58. I named it after that 58 Moulton bus that I would take from the Rexdale Mall to my jobs at the airport. I had a couple of jobs at the airport in my lifetime. But one thing I know about Moulton, and like a lot of neighborhoods, there are streets named after people. And sometimes it's just, a developer or whatever, but there are streets named after people. Tell me a secret history of one of the people that have a street named after them in our beloved Moulton. Thank you.
Thank you, George, for your question. I really appreciate you taking the time to reach out to a place that's near and dear to you, and from your own personal history. And you challenged me to explore the name of a road name within Moulton, and there are many we could choose from. Really, every community. There's always an old saying that people don't name things after people or places or events that they want to forget, and a good example here is within Moulton itself. And looking about, there are many names we could have chosen to look at: Harold Sheard, Lancaster, McNaughton, all the road names from the old Moulton town site, amongst many others. But for this, I've chosen Codlin Avenue, Codlin, Codlin Avenue. Codlin Avenue is named for the Codlin family. Thomas Codlin bought the west half of Lot 11, Concession 7, in 1890, about a 50-acre farm at the time. A year later, in 1891, Thomas built a substantial and stunningly beautiful red brick Gothic Revival farmhouse. Thomas and his wife Elizabeth had 5 children. They were James, Frederick, Ida, Ethel, and George. And Thomas was engaged in mixed farming. He had fruit and vegetables as well as cattle and poultry on the farm, quite a successful farm at the time. And when Thomas passed away in 1918, the farm was left to his son Fred Codlin. He inherited the farm, and for a time his brother George resided and assisted with the farm as well. Fred and his wife Mabel Machinter, they had 3 children, Vera, Doris, and Earl. In addition to farming, Fred Codlin was also an implement dealer for McCormick and Deering. The Codlins were known to have the first automobile in Moulton and the first residential telephone in their house. The Codlins were really a well-known and well-liked family in the Moulton area. In addition to his tasks as farming and his business interests, Fred was a long-serving trustee on the board for the Moulton Police Village after 1914. And in 1942, the Codlins were in very close proximity to the newly founded airport. Of course, now the Pearson International Airport. But in 1942, the airport was geared more towards wartime industries, and the federal government expropriated most of the Codlin farm for the construction of Victory Village, which was a wartime housing residential subdivision in connection largely to wartime industries, and in particular Victory aircraft, and mostly famed in the Second World War for the building of the Lancaster bombers. After the Second World War, many of the employees who lived in Victory Village were associated with Avey Row Canada, and of course the construction of the Avro Aero grow. The Codlins themselves, after their farm had been expropriated, they retained a small 2.5-acre plot, and they remained in their farmhouse for the rest of their lives. Fred passed away in 1956, and his wife Mabel in 1983. The old Codlin house was demolished in 1992, but the name of the Codlin family, long associated with Moulton, well liked and well respected in the Moulton community. The name itself remembered on the road name today in Victory Village, Codlin Avenue. So there's a brief story at the look of the name origin for Codlin Avenue, and perhaps in future issues we can explore some of the other names and perhaps some of the names that were once on the landscape but are no longer. In fact, something referred to at the time as Holderness Street, its name never stuck, but we know it today more as Dairy Road. So, well, it's the ways in which we can explore the history of community and in different ways. The place in which we live and engage with every day. Again, people don't name things after things they want to forget, and Codlin Avenue is a good example of that, remembering an early farming family within this community, and many residential houses reside on their former farm today within the Moulton community. So again, thank you, and we look forward to chatting with you another time on Ask a Historian. Thank you.
In honor of National Indigenous Peoples Day, I would like to ask Heritage Mississaugas historian to tell us more about the history of First Nations communities right here in Mississauga Lakeshore. The name Port Credits in particular is cherished by our residents and our visitors alike. Could you tell us more about the Indigenous history behind the name, a history that dates back thousands of years?
Thank you for your question, Sven. You've asked a broad-reaching one, and so we're going to touch on a number of subjects here. But Port Credit does indeed have a fascinating story and history, as does the surrounding city of Mississauga, of course, with rich examples of connections to Indigenous culture and Indigenous history within our community. There are a multitude of archaeological sites around the city that connect to early peoples and Indigenous peoples who once traversed this landscape. People have lived along the shores of Lake Ontario, and specifically in what is now the city of Mississauga and around the mouth of the Credit River. People have lived on this landscape and engaged with this landscape for over 10,000 years. We're dealing with multiples of generations of people that have walked on this land. I often tell people, I said, people may not have lived in your house before, or only a handful of different families over time, but people have walked on this land for generations upon generations. So a little bit like a layer of an onion. You peel something back and there's something underneath, and so we have a rich, deep roots of local history, and particularly connecting to Indigenous peoples within this community. There's very little in the way of tangible physical evidence of pre-contact Indigenous people. Archaeology throughout our city has found examples, again, over 10,000 years of history, Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Woodland, and Iroquoian sites. We're most familiar in our kind of vernacular and local connections with the Mississaugas, an Ojibwa nation, who were the latest inhabitants, if you will, when we look at the Indigenous time frame for the settlement of the story of Mississauga, and indeed the Credit River Valley. Between 1650 and 1720, there was a transition in this area between Iroquoian-speaking people and the arrival of the Mississaugas. The Mississauga are part of the Ojibwa nation of the Algonquian culture family, and they came to settle around the mouth of the Credit River and the shore of Lake Ontario in the 1720s or thereabouts. Less than 100 years later, in 1805, the British Crown and the Mississaugas entered into negotiations to acquire land. The British Crown was looking to acquire land in advance of incoming settlers, and an agreement was reached, a provisional agreement, on August 2nd of 1805. And this treaty is known as Provisional Treaty 13A, and it transferred over 70,000 acres of land from the Indigenous Mississaugas to the British British Crown to a depth of 6 miles. That is marked by Eglinton Avenue today, from the Etobicoke Creek to Burlington Bay. So to give you an idea of the breadth of it, the Mississaugas retained control of a 1 mile on each side of the Credit River, as well as the fishery and land around the mouths of the 12 and 16 mile creeks. But the Credit River is what we'll focus on, that 1 mile on each side of the Credit River from its mouth to a depth of 6 miles inland. Of course, Port Credit, and to focus on your question today, resides within that 1 mile itself. The treaties continued. The British Crown signed additional treaties in 1818 for the land north of Eglinton Avenue, known as Treaty 19. And in 1820, they signed treaties 22 and 23. And this principally looked at the land that had been retained in the first treaty, and that was the 1 mile on each side of the Credit River and the mouths of the 12 and 16 mile creek. So after the treaties of 1820, the Mississaugas retained title to a single 200-acre parcel of land. A portion of that land today is where the Mississauga Golf and Country Club is today on Mississauga Road. In 1825, the Mississaugas became a bolstered community in a sense, with the arrival of individuals such as Reverend Peter Jones, and eventually in 1826 the establishment of what became known as the Credit Mission Village, and that was again on Mississauga Road near where the Mississauga Golf and Country Club is today. And perhaps that's a story we can delve into in greater detail with more stories in the future, the story of Reverend Peter Jones and the Credit Mission. But regardless itself, the Mississaugas resided at the Credit Mission, the Indigenous Mississaugas at the Credit Mission from 1826 until relocation, when they removed themselves from historic Mississauga and resettled on at the new Credit Reserve south of Hagersville in 1847. But to focus on your question and the Credit River and Port Credit itself, for Indigenous peoples and early settlers, the river itself was mandatory for life, if you will. It sustained them. It provided resources. It provided water power. It provided fresh water. There were fisheries, transportation routes, trade networks, all connected to the life around the Credit River itself. To the Indigenous Mississaugas, they referred to the river as the Missinihi. It translates as Trusting Creek, and that was named in reference to the trade that took place along its shores. A trade based on trust, or a trade based on credit, which is where the Credit River gets its name from, based on the Indigenous word Missinihi, the Trusting Creek. The mouth of the Credit River was identified by non-Indigenous peoples as a natural safe harbor, and a government inn was established near the mouth of the river, not far from where the Waterside Inn is today, in 1796. Elizabeth Simcoe, the wife of Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe, came to the Credit River with a party of government officials and found shelter there in 1796, and she painted a scene of what she saw just upstream from where Port Credit is today. The name of Port Credit itself became official when a Crown surveyor, Robert Lynn, registered the town plot on the west banks of the Credit River south of Lakeshore Road on June 20th, 1835. So if there is a birthday, if you will, Port Credit is born June 20th of 1835. This area, the Robert Lynn Survey area, is known today as the Port Credit Heritage Conservation District. As part of the Lynn Survey, road names were established, and some of them are still on the landscape with us today. John Street and Peter Street, north-south routes, were named for Reverend Peter Jones and his brother John Jones. So they were leaders of the Indigenous Mississaugas at the Credit Mission Village. And again, we can delve into their stories a little bit in perhaps a future episode. Mississauga Road, south of Lakeshore Road, known as Mississauga Road South today, was originally named Joseph Street after Joseph Sawyer, another chief of the Mississaugas. And so we had these three names that were emblazoned on the landscape by surveyor Robert Lynn. Two of them are still with us today. But back to Port Credit itself and connections to Indigenous people. One of the first ships to sail out of Port Credit in 1834 was named the Credit Chief. It was captained by James McLean, who was a Scottish-born, but he had married an Indigenous Mississauga woman, and he lived amongst the Credit River Mississaugas, and they entered into, with the ship and the sawmill at the Credit Mission site, and selling sawn lumber to building markets in Toronto and beyond, with thanks to McLean's ship, the Credit Chief. There is also the former First Methodist Church building, now part of the Mississauga Masonic Lodge, which was built in the 1830s as the first church in the area, and its congregation at the time of its creation included both Indigenous and non-Indigenous members. It's a fascinating story, it really is, and I've only scratched the surface here. I mean, there are so many things we could talk about and so many things we could explore, and I look forward to exploring them. But hopefully this is kind of given a nice little sum up to the question that you've asked, and perhaps open the door for future avenues of inquiry, because there are many things to draw on and connect to. Fascinating stories, many layers to the story. But of course, we are today, Port Credit and Mississauga and beyond, are part of the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit River First Nation, and we honor and reflect and celebrate that vibrant historical connection within our landscape today to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And so thank you for your question, and I look forward to future explorations. Thank you. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for your question on Birchwood Park, and for many longtime residents in the area, they may recall the name Fly Ash Park, an informal name, but a name that was recognized and used nonetheless. Some others might refer to it as Kentucky Hill, but we'll get into that in a moment as well. The name Birchwood came to be when the city acquired the property in 1974 or 75, and they renamed it, or named it formally, Birchwood Park, after the nearby creek. However, the park predates that, and locals came to call it Fly Ash Park in the late 1960s. And the reason for that, you were asking if it's a landfill. Well, it kind of is, but a different sense of a landfill, if you will. And let me walk you through the process of it. The property itself was originally part of John Trenwith's Clarkson Fill and Loam business, and a portion of that land where the hill is today was used as a gravel pit, and so there was a depression within the ground at that point. In 1966, the property was purchased from the Trenwith family by Ontario Hydro, and it was used as a deposit site for fly ash from the Lakeview and Hearn generating stations. So what is fly ash? Fly ash is the fine ash powder that is produced and collected at coal-fired power plants. Doesn't sound particularly nice, but this is part of the byproduct of producing electricity. When the coal is finely ground and injected into the burning chambers, it ignites almost immediately and produces two byproducts, what are called bottom ash and fly ash. Bottom ash is the heavier stuff that falls to the bottom and can be cleaned out and recycled in that realm. Fly ash is the stuff literally that would fly up the giant chimney stacks and be caught in filters, and ultimately those would have to be cleaned, and that byproduct, if you will, had to be disposed of. They purchased the property in Clarkson for using the gravel pit that was there to deposit fly ash, and the hill itself was created out of these deposits of fly ash. They then covered the hill with loam and soil in the early 1970s, and created the hill that we see today with the grass covering that is on there, and that's where the locals began to refer to it as Fly Ash Park. In 1974 or again 75, not entirely sure on that yet, the city of Mississauga took over ownership of the site, and the park was formally renamed as Birchwood Park, which is a name it retains to this day. For others, however, a little bit more of a fun story. Some of the kids in the 1970s, we have it recorded, referred to it as Kentucky Hill. And where did the road come from? Well, for longtime Clarkson residents, you'll remember the Kentucky Fried Chicken that used to be at the near the bottom of the hill there on Lakeshore Road, and that was the kind of the local reference to this park being close to the Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant. And the name Kentucky Hill was something that was used informally for Birchwood Park. Birchwood Park, of course, retains that name to this day. But again, Fly Ash Park, Kentucky Hill, or as it is officially known, Birchwood Park, has an interesting story to this the byproducts of a coal-fired generation for creating electricity within our community, and so that is part of our legacy of Birchwood Park and the connections to the now gone Lakeview generating station. So thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Mike Douglas with the Mississauga Arts Council, and I have a question for our historian. 100 years ago, we were in another kind of pandemic or epidemic, the Spanish flu, and it took so many lives, and I just wonder what the impact of Spanish flu was here, where we live now, and if there were any heroes of the time who were really outstanding and taking care of others. If there's anything you can share about that, I'd love to hear it. Thanks.
Hi, Mike. Thank you for your question, and indeed a timely one, looking back on the Spanish flu pandemic from just over 100 years ago. And it's amazing. It's fascinating to draw the parallels from what we're experiencing today to what those generations that came before us experienced, again, just over 100 years ago. There really is very little that we have that we can connect as a common experience between what we're experiencing with COVID-19 and past pandemics. Really, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920 offers us the kind of the best previous example of how humankind dealt with a pandemic. It's understandable that the Spanish flu is not at the forefront of our collective knowledge. There is no living memory of that time other than what historians have written and are writing about it even to this day. I even find myself exploring historic newspapers and trying to file through the material that was written in at the time 100 years ago and see how people responded to and how the medical community responded to that moment in time. In Canada, the Spanish flu arrived through the port cities in Quebec City, Montreal, and Halifax, but quickly spread westwards. The contagious element of the Spanish flu was incredible. It was fast moving. Unlike COVID-19, the Spanish flu tended to strike down those that were in the prime of their lives. The target audience, if you will, for it was really the 20 to 40-year-olds, but it was a danger to everyone in society, and the mortality rate was higher than what we're seeing with COVID-19. Thankfully, the ongoing war effort at home. You have to remember the Spanish flu comes to be right at the end of the waning years of the First World War, and so it's overshadowed in a sense by that significant moment in our collective histories as well. But the ongoing war effort at home, the close working quarters, the massive population that was in support of the war effort overseas, combined with things like Armistice Day gatherings and returning of soldiers, these were all instrumental in the spread of the disease. The Spanish flu arrived on our doorstep here in historic Mississauga in the early fall of 1918. We have references in some of the newspapers in late September, but it's really into October where you begin to see a lot of that fear of not knowing what it is and how to combat it starts to play itself out in the newspapers of the time. The news had been percolating before that, but it really here, ground zero for Mississauga, if you will, was late September or early October of 1918. There are elements of fear and panic and not understanding, and that was compounded by the fact that the medical community itself didn't really know how to diagnose nor treat the Spanish flu, and it was spreading so very quickly. Very quickly, the medical supports that were available, limited as they were, became overrun. And so a great deal of difficulty in terms of kind of navigating through that field as to what the medical community was actually able to do at that moment in time. Much like anywhere else in the province, and much like, honestly, much like we're seeing today, the closures, things that we come to know the term social distancing. They didn't necessarily use those terms in 1918, but the concept was the same. We're almost a carbon copy from a closure perspective of what took place in 1918. Things like closure of schools, closure of churches, public gatherings canceled, public offices closed, recommendations to close businesses. Some did, some did not. Some altered their business practices and their open hours and the like. There was not an overarching body that controlled or organized the response. There tended to be some fluctuations within municipalities on how they responded and what their own medical advice told them to do. But things like quarantine and diagnosis, they were difficult to impose. Difficult to analyze the success of those things. A quote here, and again, this draws the parallel from what we saw even a month ago with COVID-19, but this is a quote from 1918. Municipal and provincial authorities tried to save lives by prohibiting public gatherings and by isolating the sick, but the rates of infection grew, and the number of healthy workers declined. Before long, the Canadian economy was paralyzed. Healthcare professionals were perhaps the hardest hit. And so, again, those are realistic comparisons to what we're seeing today, and what happened just over 100 years ago. It's hard to determine the numbers, if you will. We have a lot more kind of hard fact numbers today with COVID-19, and maybe it's the communications we have today versus 1919. Some of the causes of death back then were given from the symptoms themselves, not necessarily related to or identified as Spanish flu, but it's reported somewhere between 10,000 and 4,000 people in Ontario passed away. And for historic Peel County, of which Mississauga is a part, between 50 and 600. Now that seems like a large discrepancy there, but again, it comes down to identifying the cause of death. So somewhere between 50 and 600. We rather expect from our research that the fatality numbers for historic Mississauga were around 100 people. That does not sound like a great deal when you're looking at the numbers of COVID-19, but our population was incrementally smaller than it is today. The actual rate of death per capita was higher during the Spanish flu than it is right now, and so hopefully that's something we're able to maintain and diminish even further in this day and age. With no vaccine or effective treatment, the Spanish flu spread to every country around the world, and it came in waves. We hear things in the news today about the second wave. The Spanish flu came in waves, and it really was the second wave of the Spanish flu that hit historic Mississauga and indeed Canada at the time, and about 90% of the fatalities were in the second wave of the Spanish flu overall. There were subsequent waves in the spring of 1919 into the winter of 1920, but eventually it did peter out. The closures themselves, people are looking at parallels to the closures. They didn't last as long as we are in today. They started to relax closures kind of end of November. So the original closures for us were the end of October, and then by the end of November things started to relax, but not entirely. Some things remained in fluctuation in terms of service and open hours and such into the spring of 1919. Overall, 55,000 Canadians lost their lives during the Spanish flu, it's estimated, and approximately 2.5 to 5% of the global population, which is staggering, between 55 and 100 million people. Unbelievable at the time, and it's scary to look at the numbers like that and draw comparisons today. Again, COVID is not hitting, although it's hitting hard and every loss of life is tragic, it is not at the same level as to what the Spanish flu was claiming. But again, our medical knowledge is much more advanced today than it was in 1918. Our first issue of closures, again, October 31st of 1918, issued in the Streetsville Review by Medical Health Officer for Peel County, Dr. Austin Howard McFadden of Cooksville. But again, they became overwhelmed in trying to deal with this, and that becomes very prevalent when you look at the material of this, not knowing what it was they were fighting or how to fight it. In local terms, your question really focused on, I think, angels, if you will, or local heroes that serve their community, and we're drawn to looking at those that are on the front lines, if we use a modern term, the healthcare professionals who tried to alleviate the sufferings of those who were afflicted, and both not only at home but also overseas. We have to remember the Spanish flu is twined significantly with the story of the close of the First World War. Local doctors, Dr. Arthur Bennett Sutton of Port Credit and Dr. Harold Chester Sutton of Cooksville were very much involved in fighting the pandemic at this time, as was the aforementioned Dr. Howard Austin McFadden, also of Cooksville, and very much involved. And there were multiple other doctors as well, but I'm really drawn to looking at those that were providing the immediate daily care for those that suffered from the Spanish flu, and that being the nurses at the time. Two nurses. I'll draw two angels, if you will, from your question. Nurse Margaret Orr of Clarkson, who graduated from the Toronto General Hospital in 1914 and served in hospitals in Toronto during the Spanish flu pandemic. Over the course of her career, she served at the Toronto General Hospital, the Shriners Hospital in Montreal, and with the Peel chapter of the Victorian Order of Nurses, which was founded in the midst of the Spanish flu pandemic. So Margaret Orr of Clarkson is one that comes to mind. Another, and perhaps one that I think is a shining example for Canadian involvement during the First World War, is nursing sister Ida Harcourt of Streetsville. Ida enlisted in 1917 and left Canada for England on June 25th, 1918, right at the end of the First World War. She served with the number 11 Canadian General Hospital in Bramshot and the number 16 Canadian General Hospital in Oprington. Ida herself, while treating wounded soldiers and soldiers infected with the Spanish flu or the influenza, she contracted influenza herself in November of 18, but was cleared to return to duty 2 weeks later. And again, likely falling ill through the treatment of others. She returned to Canada in August of 1919, and for her service, Ida was awarded the Royal Red Cross Medal from her time overseas during the First World War. So a nod out to Nurse Margaret Orr of Clarkson and nursing sister Ida Harcourt of Streetsville. There are many others. I'm kind of cherry picking here, if you will, but timely to think on what has come before us and looking at the lessons that history can teach us. But history can teach us one other thing as well, and that is that COVID-19 will also pass. We will get through this. We will emerge from this, and we will have new stories to share with future generations. And we look forward to exploring both our past and the stories we're collecting now with this common experience that we're having during the COVID-19 times. And so, again, thank you, Mike, for your question and for allowing us to meander down the path of history as we reflect on that significant moment in time and draw its comparisons to today. Thank you. As part of Ask a Historian this week, we're going to pay tribute to someone who gave a lot back to the historical community and sadly left us. We remember Eric Gibson. Eric Gibson passed away on June 4th of 2020, and he spent the last probably more than 40 years of his life giving back to his community, first here in Mississauga and then in Paris, Ontario. Eric was in his 86th year. Eric was born in South Wales, and he came to Canada from England in 1964. And early in his working career, he worked with Rolls-Royce in the aircraft engine division, and then as Pratt & Whitney for 27 years as an engineer and senior designer, first in Montreal and later in Mississauga. Eric's many interests included stamp collecting, local history, reading, freelance writing. Eric also published a book, Mississauga Moments, an anthology of local fact, fiction, and legend in 1999. Eric is fondly remembered by many of us for his dedication, his countless hours of commitment and support of local history, and a humble and truly gracious nature, and a great sense of humor, self-depreciating humor, but just fantastic humor. He's a valued volunteer member of Heritage Mississauga and a multi-term past president of the Mississauga South Historical Society. A published author, a regular contributor to publications of the Heritage News and the Lighthouse, publications of Heritage Mississauga and MSHS. After his move to Paris, Eric became actively involved with the Paris Museum and Historical Society. Eric was also a past chair of the Mississauga Stamp Club and the Mississauga Camera Club. So a very involved and dedicated person. Eric was involved in speaking engagements, fundraising events, awareness events, exhibits, research projects, membership drives. He was also an actor for many years in our Haunted Mississauga program with Heritage Mississauga. He wrote plays, participated in tours, just engaged in the community in so many ways. Eric had a particular affinity and interest in things that flew or floated or rolled on rails. Planes, the Averero, airships, trains, boats on the Great Lakes. Truly, many of us spent many happy hours wandering down memory lane with Eric. Eric was presented with a Lifetime Membership Award from Heritage Mississauga in 2008. He was highly active and respected in the surrounding heritage community, as well as a speaker, a knowledgeable source of information, and a valuable community historian. Eric was predeceased by his wife Marion, who is also a long-serving member of the board of directors for Heritage Mississauga. He will be dearly missed and lovingly remembered by all who knew him, including his cherished friend Linda Charlton in Paris. Just a fantastic individual who gave selflessly back to his community. And from myself as one community historian to another, and Eric, thank you for all that you did. We appreciate it. Invaluable support to me early in my career, and you will be missed. So to Eric, and remembering fondly Eric, and for all those who knew him, thank you, and rest well.